So today we continue the story of Abraham and Sarah, which we heard a little bit of last week. And we hear a familiar story for a lot of us. It's about the time they entertained God unawares. And just a word before I read it, because every time I read this story, there's one thing that gets my attention. 3 strangers show up unannounced, unexpectedly. Abraham, being a good host, says, "Here, take a rest, take a break, have a seat, let me get some bread for you." And then they take the flour, they knead the flour, they let it rise, they bake the bread, they go kill the calf. I mean, how many people, if they showed up unexpectedly at your house, would have you saying, "Now let me run out to the store and get the best beef that's out there. I'll have to defrost it. Can you hang around for a few hours while I smoke it on the grill?" And anyway, that's what happened in this story here. And every time I read it, I think about that. And it's like, I don't think I'm as hospitable as Abraham. So the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant." And just a word there about Lord. He just sees 3 strangers. That was the polite way to address strangers who showed up. "Do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought. Wash your feet. Rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. And they said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "Oh, yes, you did." The Lord dealt with Sarah as was said, and the Lord did for Sarah as was promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave Sarah the name Isaac. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." A word of God that is still speaking. Thanks be to God. Quick question for you all. How many of you feel like you have ever heard clearly, unequivocally, without a doubt, with all clarity, God speaking to you and telling you something to do? A few of us have, yeah. How many have wanted God to be that clear? Yeah. It's only happened to me once in my life. I've wanted it to be clear every other time. One of the responsibility of session is, as you probably know, session, for those who don't know, is the governing council of the church, is to be constantly asking the question, where is God leading us? What is the future God is inviting us to be a part of? As followers of Jesus Christ, we have taken vows to follow him and his ways, to be his presence in the world. So it only seems appropriate to ask, well, what do you want that to look like? How do you want me to do that? How are we called to do that as a church in this time and this place? The question came up at one of our recent session meetings as we were doing this. How do I tell the difference between God's voice and my own? What a great question. Because no doubt, we could probably all think of times when someone claims to be following God's direction, God's directives, only to us, we look at that and they seem to be exactly the opposite of what we would expect from a loving God. So it's tempting to say they are fooling themselves into thinking the voices in their head is really God, when they're really just hearing their own biases and oftentimes fears. Easy to say that about other people, isn't it? How do we avoid falling into that trap ourselves? How do we avoid confusing our voice with God's? Let's look at the story of Abraham and Sarah. We talked about it last week. He was about 100, she was about 90 when Isaac was born. They did not need modern science to tell them that their childbearing years were long past, and yet God promised them a child. If that were you, would you be wondering, is that really God? The promise was so far-fetched even to Abraham and Sarah, and yet they somehow believed it would happen, but they also didn't believe it would happen quite like what God said. They knew Sarah's womb was not exactly prime real estate for a fetus. So Sarah, to help God along, suggested that Abraham sleep with Hagar, her handmaid, and that the child born of that union would surely be the one that God had intended. No, they were wrong. I think we all know that. In today's reading, Abraham hears that story again. He's entertaining angels unawares, the way this often is told for this story. 3 messengers from God are coming and talking to Abraham. He doesn't know who they are at first, but they together reiterate that promise of God that Abraham and Sarah would have a son. By this time, Abraham and Hagar have already had a child, Ishmael. So surely by now they are getting the sense that, okay, maybe that wasn't the plan. Maybe God has another plan. But nonetheless, Sarah laughs because it is still just an outrageous promise. It makes no sense whatsoever. They knew there was no chance in anything that this would happen. But they finally figured out that these are messengers from God, speaking with God's voice. So even though Sarah laughed at the impossibility of it all and was embarrassed when they caught her at it, they somehow held on to that belief that, yes, God really did say this, and it really is impossible, and really there's no way it could happen, but somehow we believe it will. Why were they so sure? Why were they so sure about that? They were fortunate that God spoke very clearly to them, even if it didn't make sense to them at the time. But nonetheless, they heard. Now, the first time they heard it, and then they listened to their own voices and said, it's like, no, surely God did not mean that impossible thing to happen. God meant for this possible thing to happen. Let's help us along. And I have a feeling that we might have been in that kind of position ourselves sometimes, hearing something that we think might be of God that sounds just so outrageous, and then we try to, like, I'll just say, dumb it down to it's like, okay, God's calling us to do this thing that's totally impossible, so how can we make it possible? How can we kind of tone it down and do what's reasonable with our resources and the world we live in? I doubt that any of us, had we been there in Abraham's shoes, would have just taken the word of these 3 strangers as the voice of God, and the story ends right there, and that's just the way it is. We're going to try to figure out, like they did, well, maybe that is God. How can we make that happen? But I think we do a lot of listening. I think we really do try to figure out what is God saying to us, where is God leading us, whether that's as a church or individually as people. I think most of us wish God were as obvious and as blunt as these strangers were. I'll just speak for myself. More than once, I've been torn between two very different directions for career paths. And frankly, a postcard from God saying choose option A over B would have been very much appreciated. But there was no postcard, there was no email, and there was no text. Just a voice in one ear saying, well, this is the way, and a voice in the other ear saying, no, I really think you need to look at this option over here. Which brings us back to that question. How do you tell whose voice it is? How do you know if what you are hearing is from God or from you? How about this? If it asks you to do the impossible, if it asks you to do something that makes you uncomfortable, if it asks you to step out on a limb, it just might be from God. Think about it. You ever heard the phrase, God will never give you more than you can handle? Anybody know where that is in the Bible, by the way? Yeah, they know. It's my favorite verse that's not in the Bible anywhere. But somehow I hear that so often. But instead, the Bible is full of stories about God asking us to do impossible things. Giving birth when you're 90 years old. Jesus sending his disciples out into the world with very specific directives. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. We are all followers of Jesus Christ. Does anybody here cast out a demon? Sue's thinking about it. Raise the dead? I think we failed. The work Jesus sent them to do was impossible for them to do by themselves. They could only do it with God working through them. You know the name Gideon? Gideon is one of the judges in the Old Testament, book of Judges, no big surprise there. He was leader of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, leader of the tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh was facing war with the Midianites, and God, as God's habit, raises up a leader from the people to meet that challenge. So God raised up Gideon as a leader for Manasseh. And he protested. He said, I am from the weakest clan in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. You've picked the wrong person. And yet he was the one God chose. When it came time to do battle, God looked at Gideon. Gideon had gathered the army of Manasseh together, which is basically every man who was able to fight, and looked at Gideon's army and said, we got a problem here. Your army is too big. If you defeat the Midianites with your army, everyone was going to think it was by your own hand. So God had him take the army to the river to drink, and most of the men cupped their hands and brought the water up to their mouth and drank that way. And God said, send them home, which left about 300 soldiers, 300 men, to do battle against thousands of Midianites. And they won. It was an impossible situation, and they won because God fought with them. They could never have done it by themselves. The Bible is full of stories of God saying, I want you to do this impossible thing. Have faith and trust. So with that, how do you know if it's God's voice or yours you hear rumbling around in your head? If it seems impossible, it's probably not your voice. It may be God's. Contrary to that old folk wisdom, that God doesn't give you more than you can handle, God always asks more of us than we could do by ourselves. But God never intended us to do it by ourselves. We hear in Scripture that all things are possible with God. It's that last two words that are the most important. So if it seems impossible, it might be from God. If it makes you uncomfortable, it's probably not your voice you're hearing. Now, there is a special breed of people who thrive on the adrenaline rush that comes from doing risky things and being uncomfortable. Most of us are not those people. We seek comfort, not discomfort. We seek safety, not risk. So if it's saying, take the comfortable route, that might be your voice. And if it says, take the uncomfortable route, that might be God's voice. And if it challenges you beyond what you've ever done before, it's probably not your voice you're hearing either. Jesus asks his disciples to give up the safety net of their jobs and their families and follow him and raise the dead. But never forget, his power was at work in them and through them. What God asks us to do, God does with us. And where God asks us to go, God goes with us. Now, if what you hear makes you uncomfortable, seems impossible, and challenges you beyond what you've ever done before, does that mean it is necessarily God's voice that you hear? Maybe, and maybe not. It's one thing to say, okay, I know that voice isn't mine. It's not just my voice I'm hearing rattling around in my head. But it is another thing to say it's from God. It may not be. And that goes for whether the voice challenges us or not, by the way. Because most of us carry echoes of voices from our childhood that trigger feelings of insecurity and make us think things are impossible or uncomfortable, so we will take that safe route. Some of those voices trigger in us things that make us think that, oh, we have to do this impossible thing to be of value. That isn't necessarily God's voice either. And there are also voices that try to convince us that 2 + 2 = 5, and somehow, in weird ways, that can make sense to us. There are lots of things that influence what voices we hear in our heads and that influence which ones we follow. So we would do well to do a little introspection when we're trying to figure out what we think God is saying with all of these other voices in our head. I think we also need to, in that introspection, beware of the temptation to resist what makes us uncomfortable or seems impossible. Because when we automatically resist things and we give into that temptation, that leads to the preservation of the status quo and turning inward. Preservation of the status quo never leads to healthy change, and it never nourishes us or others. If Jesus hadn't have shook up the status quo of his religion and community, he never would have ended up on the cross, and we never would have ended up here. We need to test the spirits. 1 John, the letter of 1 John, the author says, don't believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. I know I've told you before how I ended up pursuing a career in ministry instead of archaeology. This was the one time I heard God's voice clearly, middle of the night, literally with words, but just in my head. And it was so clear and so foreign to anything else I'd ever thought of. I called my pastor and I said, let me tell you what happened. I don't know if this is of God. I don't know if it's for me. I didn't use those exact words. I'm sure about that, but help me figure out what I'm hearing. And then I called some friends, and we talked about it. And ultimately, we all came to the same conclusion that it was from God. And so here I am today. I could have been out on a dig somewhere getting dirty right now and having a great time, but instead I'm here having a great time. When you think you're hearing something that might be from God, test it. Talk to people about it, people who know you, people who understand your faith. Don't just pray about it. And that may sound odd, but think about it. If you're trying to figure out if something is from God or not, praying about it just in a way kind of complicates that if that's all you do. Because the answers to your prayer, is that your voice or is it from God? I think we need to take that part seriously too. So if you're really trying to figure out if you're hearing God's voice, test it. Ask yourself, is this triggering something from my past? Is it triggering a fear? Is it encouraging me in another way? Talk to people who know you and talk it out with them. I love the Quaker tradition of, I forgot what it was called now. A second ago I had it. But they have this practice of when you're trying to figure out something, gather together the community, tell them the basic story of what you're trying to figure out, and they just ask you questions. They don't give you advice. They ask you questions. And through that process, their clarity meetings, that's what it's called. And through that process, the hope is you'll gain clarity about what God is calling you to do. So gather those outside voices and ask yourself, is what you are hearing or sensing something expresses hope for tomorrow? Does it reflect divine love for all people? Does it seek to build up and not destroy? Does it show respect for others? Does it serve others and not just yourself? Does it embody the promise that you will be more tomorrow than you are today? And does it bring this world a little bit closer to the realm of God? If you answer no to those questions, that should be all you need to know. But if you answer yes to those questions, chances are what you're hearing is from God. Just know that if you then follow down that path that you're called, it's probably going to ask you to do impossible things. It's probably going to make you uncomfortable, and it's probably going to stretch you beyond limits you thought you had. It will not be easy. But Jesus calls us to meaningful work, not easy work. It will be significant, and it will change lives, not the least your own. Amen.